And then this shouldn't be covered. So ideally,
It shouldn't be covered.
yeah, it shouldn't be covered.
If I put it on a bucket like this, would it work?
It would, but it would be great if you could just make
Okay.
sure that this doesn't.
Okay, good. Do we have a pointer? Ah, I see it.
We are delighted to hear about the spatial implications of telecommuting from Andre.
Okay, it works. Well, thanks a lot for having the paper. Thanks for organizing this great event. I learned a lot about work from home, much more than I knew before this conference. It also informs our work. And this is joint work with Matt Delventel, who is sitting here as well. Okay, so I don't have to motivate this audience. We know that work from home was relatively minor before COVID, even though the potential for work from home was great. And we expect to see much work from home after COVID, based on the survey by Jose Maria, Nick, and Steve, and other pieces of evidence. So the main question I'm going to ask in this paper is, given that this rise of work from home, and if it indeed becomes permanent, how will it affect economic geography? Okay. And our motivation comes to some extent from the theoretical side. We have a tradition of modeling economic geography in ways that assume daily commuting. We have a class of models of systems of cities, and those models always assume that you have to live and work in the same metropolitan area. There is no argument about that, right? You wouldn't live in a different metropolitan area if you have to commute daily. In models of internal city structure, people are allowed to live and work in different locations, but they cannot be too far away, again, because they have to commute daily. And if we allow for telecommuting in those models, it means that the needs to live close to your work is not as strong as before. And you can potentially think about people living in different metropolitan areas from the area of their work, or living a little bit farther from their jobs within a city. So that's one implication for economic geography. Another implication is that as people work from home more often, they would need more residential real estate, say for home offices, and less commercial real estate. And this has geographic implications too. And the third important implication that we will talk about is that as people show up to the office less frequently, it may lead to changes in firm productivity, as Yi Chen showed in his paper on Wednesday. As I learned yesterday, the evidence is unclear about productivity effects of work from home. I think we still have a lot to learn about it, but potentially there are implications for productivity within firms, which will affect the country as a whole, and as a result, affect the locations of jobs and residences. Okay, so what do we do in this paper? We do a lot of things. That's a long paper. I need like 3 hours to present everything, but I only have 20 minutes. So we document a bunch of facts about work from home before COVID, and most of these facts will be familiar, so I'm not going to show you anything. But the reason we need those facts is to build a quantitative model. Okay, so we want to build a quantitative model which is consistent with facts about work from home before COVID, and then we'll run counterfactuals with those models, with the model, generating an increase in work from home with the purpose of understanding how things change. And what are the things that we look at? We will make predictions about the relocations of jobs and residents, both between and within local labor markets, implications for real estate prices, wages and wage inequality, commuting patterns, and ultimately aggregate all of these changes into welfare changes. And this is a quantitative model. You may argue whether it's good or not. It will spit out some predictions, but will also show that our predictions make sense. And when we compare our predictions with what happened during COVID in 2020, 2021, we find that our model is making reasonably good predictions for changes in the quantity of residents in very granular locations, changes in rents and prices. Okay. There is a big literature, and most of the literature is in the last couple of years, so we contribute to this literature. Okay, in terms of locations, our model has a lot of locations, 4,500, and we think these locations are intersections of PUMAs and counties. Think about a location in our model, something like Santa Monica, Upper West Side, Chicago Loop, and we have a lot of locations in dense areas, and locations are larger in places where few people live. This allows us to study the implications of telecommuting for internal city structure at the same time as we can also study relocations across cities. Okay, our model is populated by workers, which are heterogeneous along several dimensions. They can be college or non-college. They can be in two occupations. One occupation allows them to telecommute and one doesn't allow to telecommute. And these are exogenous. Okay, well, obviously people can change occupation in reality, but in our model, they cannot. We can talk about this later. What people can choose is the industry of work, is either tradable or non-tradable. And the reason we want to think about tradable versus non-tradable is we want to understand the impact of work from home on those non-tradable, typically low-skilled workers who provide local services for the community. In our model, workers can choose where to live, and all else equal, they would go for places with high amenities, low housing costs, and low cost of non-tradable goods. And they choose where to work, which is a different location. And they go for high wages and preferably short commutes. Okay, so far, this has been pretty standard. We had models similar to those in the literature. What is new in our model is that those who work in occupations that allow them to telecommute, they choose a variable theta between 0 and 1, which represents how often they want to work in the office versus at home. Okay, and you can imagine that if your theta is relatively low, then you can choose a workplace location quite far from where you live because you have to commute like once a week. Okay, this is the only equation I'm going to show you, and I'm going to explain it so you don't have to try to read it. We have a closed form solution for the optimal amount of work from home in the model, and the optimal amount of work from home depends on 4 factors. You will work from home more often if the relative productivity of remote work is high, and this relative productivity is different by education and sector of work, tradable, non-tradable. You will want to work from home more often if the floor space at home is relatively cheap. The idea here is that if you can afford to buy a bigger house, you have a home office, this makes you more productive and is more pleasant to work at home. You will choose to work from home more often if your commuting time is long, though commuting time is also dependent on the choice of where to live and where to work, so they interact. And the last factor that determines how much you want to work from home is what we call disutility of work from home, aversion to work from home. And this represents, this is sort of a black box, you know, in a sense. It represents all other reasons why people choose to work from home or not, and be things like social stigma against working from home, conventions, firm policies, or actual disutility. I don't know, maybe you have a bunch of kids at home and they don't let you focus on your work. Okay, so a lot of things will be in this black box parameter, and this will be an important determinant of work from home. Okay, the rest of the model is pretty standard except a couple of things. So we have firms producing goods, we have developers building floor space, and unlike in a standard model, now we have 3 kinds of floor space. There is residential, commercial, but also home office floor space. But all floor space will have a single price, so it doesn't really matter. The developer doesn't care which floor space they are building. And we also have local externalities, and we allow for productivity to depend on the local density of workers as a standard in this kinds of models. What is not standard is we also allow remote workers and on-site workers contribute differently to those externalities. And potentially, there are productivity losses coming from the fact that people are not interacting face-to-face. And we also allow residential amenities to be endogenous and depend on the density of local residents. Okay, so before I go to the quantitative model, let me just summarize what work from home does in our model. At the individual level, it reduces commuting costs, which is good. It increases housing costs, which is not good. And it may affect income, depending on whether you are more or less productive working at home. At the aggregate level, there are higher level effects. The primary effects are that there will be migration of both jobs and residences. There are changes in real estate demand and prices. And there are changes in aggregate productivity coming from the fact that you may lose those productive spillovers. And these three primary effects will generate secondary effects on everything else in the economy. Okay, the quantitative model. We calibrate the model to 2012, 2016. This is the most recent period for which we have all the data we need. So think about this as pre-COVID. We have data for all those 4,500 locations for employment, residence, wages, housing costs. We also allow housing supply elasticities to be different across locations. And this is important because as people move from more supply inelastic to more supply elastic places, housing prices will respond differently to the increase in housing demand. And we also have bilateral data on commuting flows and commuting times. There are lots of parameters in the model. Most of them are taken from the literature. Some of them are estimated. And there are also 3 sets of parameters which are specific to work from home. And they are different for people with different education levels working in different industries. So we have different productivities of remote work, which are different for college, non-college, tradable, non-tradable. We have different elasticities of substitution between on-site and remote work, which is also different by type. And this disutility or aversion parameter that I talked about before can also be different by type. And we calibrate those parameters to match the pre-COVID frequency of working in the office, okay? Which is, for example, lower for college tradable, but very high for non-college non-tradable. This is the distribution of commuting frequencies before COVID for non-college non-tradable. So this theta is basically the fraction of the week that you work in the office, with one being like 5 days a week. So obviously we have a lot of work on site for non-college non-tradable, but for college tradable, even before COVID, we have a substantial amount of working from home. Okay, let me skip this. Okay, so the counterfactual exercise that we do is the following. We will change this disutility parameter so as to generate the increase in work from home as predicted by the survey by Nick, Steve, and Jose Maria. Basically, your survey comes true, and we try to predict what happens in terms of economic geography. And since you have data on different types of workers, we have different predictions in the increase in remote work for different types of workers. And we see that, so black is before COVID, gray is after COVID. We see that there is a shift towards more work from home for all types of workers, and especially for college tradable and college non-tradable. And this requires us to substantially reduce those disutility parameters. Okay, so in the time I have left, there are some obvious things that we predict and some less obvious. So for example, our model generates relocation of workers, relocations of residents from more dense to less dense locations. And this is a mix of 2 things. So people who can work from home, they relocate big time to less dense places. But people who cannot work at home, they actually centralize. They take advantage from the fact that people move out of those central areas, housing prices go down, they move closer to their jobs. And you can see it on the map. For example, in New York, people on average leave central areas and they move to more suburban areas. So for jobs, the pattern is less clear. The jobs seem to decentralize, but to a lesser extent. And this is a mix of 2 things. We have non-tradable jobs, and they decentralize. But tradable jobs actually, if anything, they centralize in the most dense locations. So what is happening here is that big, dense, productive locations like the Silicon Valley, Manhattan, they can hire people not only from Manhattan or New York metropolitan area, they can hire people from greater radius, right? And because they are so productive, we see an increase in the match between productive people and productive locations. And this drives income inequality across workers in the country. And you can see it on the map of New York. So this is tradable jobs in New York. They increase big time because according to our calibration, these locations are very productive. we have predictions for real estate prices, and prices fall in central areas, they increase in non-central areas. Given that I'm running out of time, let me spend a couple of minutes on aggregate results, and then I'm going to show you how our model compares with the actual data that we see during COVID. Okay, so there is a lot of heterogeneity in the model. Different people have different productivities of remote work. But if you aggregate everything, we see a slight increase in income when there is more telecommuting. And this is happening on the one hand because our calibrated work from home productivity is larger than productivity in the office for an average worker. But on the other hand, we have those negative externalities playing in. But the net effect is 1.6 increase in income. We have large positive effects through commuting costs. Okay, an average worker commutes much less, and this affects welfare. People benefit also from paying less for housing prices, but the benefit largely accrues to those who can work from home and move to those remote areas. Non-tradable prices, on the other hand, increase because according to our calibration, those remote areas are less productive in producing non-tradables. And overall, there is a welfare gain coming from the increase in work from home, but it only accrues to those who can work from home. Okay, so that's our story. Work from home is good for an average worker, but the average comes from the fact that those who can work from home benefit big time, but those who cannot actually lose out. And one important reason why they lose out is that, again, there are those productive externalities that make the economy less productive, and non-remote workers don't benefit from the ability to work from home. Again, if you change that assumption about externalities, things may change, and we do it in the paper, but I'm not going to show it today. In the last couple of minutes, let me just show how our model compares with the data. There has been evidence that people actually moved from more to less dense places during COVID, mostly within metropolitan areas. And there was evidence that, that's not right. Rents increased everywhere, but they increased more in suburban locations than in central locations. So what we do, we use SafeGraph cell phone data to see where people moved around at a very granular level. And we use Zillow data for rents and prices. And then we run a regression of our model predictions on the data. And we find that our model is reasonably highly correlated with the data, with an R-squared of 0.3 for residential locations. And most importantly for us is that even if we include density as a predictor, our model still explains the residual variance, right? I mean, we know that people move to less dense locations, but there is something else beyond density, like amenities and market access, and our model captures that as well. And our predictions hold when we include commuting zone fixed effects. So basically, we can predict what happens within cities. We run the same regression at the commuting zone level, and our model is also correlated with the data. So we also run similar regressions for housing prices and rents. And for reasons we don't fully understand yet, we cannot predict why different commuting zones experience different changes in rents and prices. So we cannot predict why Boise has increased prices so much and Houston did not. But our predictions, our model performs well within commuting zones. Okay, and again, the relocations within commuting zones are larger than those across. So those predictions hold well for both rents and prices. Okay, finally, we also, in the paper, we tried different ways of generating the increase in work from home, either through preferences or through changes in productivity. And we argue that if you assume that all of the increase in work from home is due to the increase in productivity, then the model generates weird predictions, which are not consistent with the data. Okay, let me conclude in half a minute. Do I have half a minute?
Yeah.
Okay, so in this paper, we built a spatial equilibrium model with work from home. So introducing work from home in those class of models is our main contribution. We quantify the model to the US economy before COVID, and then we run counterfactuals where work from home is higher, trying to see what will happen to the economy. We find that residents who can work from home and non-tradable jobs decentralize. we find that residents who cannot work from home and tradable jobs, they centralize, they move to denser places. Real estate prices change in different locations. There are welfare gains, but those only accrue to those who can work from home, and they come from consuming bigger houses, commuting less, and having better location matches. We don't predict the end to big cities like there were some apocalyptic predictions in the beginning of the COVID, and that's largely because most of the predicted increase in work from home is hybrid, right? If people work in a hybrid mode, they don't leave big cities, but there may be implications to central areas of large cities. And there are some key important questions that will affect our predictions that we don't know much about yet. But I think our main contribution is to build a framework which can be used to study geographic implications of remote work.
Thank you. This is really incredible. One comment, two clarifications. Comment. Do you know the paper? This came out maybe 15 years ago by Chari, McGradden, and Kehoe was on it about wedges, and it was like a business cycle model where you could back out different wedges. I feel like this framework lends itself really well to back out commuting zone wedges, which would basically be proxies for some of the distortionary policies that were introduced, and that could be like a standalone JME paper because that would be super useful. Instead of just relying on state level policies, you could back out city level time-specific wedges and just adopting the same framework that you already have. You would just do like a parentheses 1 minus omega times, and then we'd enter in some of the equilibrium conditions. And then the two clarifying questions. One was around in the aggregate results table, it looked like consumption was still increase. Or no, actually, no, that was right. There was it was positive, but the negative means that it's a welfare gain. Maybe you can go back to the slide where you had the aggregate result and clarify why a little bit about the consumption dynamics for the non-telecommuting individuals.
Yes, so actually consumption decreased for an average worker, and the reason for that is that non-tradable prices go up. So local services, things like that.
Okay, yep, that makes sense.
And again, the reason is that we calibrate those remote locations are less productive in providing those services.
Oh, and that makes sense. I mean, if it's a rural area, people aren't going to agglomerate around the restaurant. Yeah. And then really quick about, is there any thing in the preferences where there's idiosyncrasy around an individual's capability of thriving in remote work? Is that in the model, or was it more just locational heterogeneity?
No, there's nothing like that in the model. We wish we could have had that. At some point we tried, but we couldn't figure out what would be the right elasticity of those shocks.
Okay, gotcha.
We didn't do that. But
great, thank you.
It would be more realistic with that, of course.
Yeah, it's kind of a follow-up question on this actually. Really like the paper, but I guess I'm a little confused about the underlying assumption there about the spillovers on the non-tradable sector, and what's the underlying assumption on where unskilled workers are going to go. So my kind of intuition is that as the skilled working from home people move to the suburbs, there's going to be opportunities for restaurants and unskilled workers to follow them to those locations. And my prior is that a restaurant should be just as productive in the center of the city as in a suburb. And there's also work by David Otto who has argued that unskilled wage premium have actually gone very negative for unskilled workers in the centers of cities because housing costs have just eaten away all their additional revenue, right? So my prior would actually be that the non-college workers should achieve a benefit because they should be just as productive being service workers in the suburbs, but they would pay lower housing costs.
Yeah. I mean, we definitely see some of that happening, the non-tradable, non-college workers following the residents towards the suburbs. And so there are two things that people care about locally. So there are non-tradable amenities, and there are non-tradable goods. Conceptually, these are two different things. In reality, they may not necessarily be different things. But again, so there is I'm just telling you how the model works, whether it's good or not. There is an exogenous productivity parameter that represents how productive a non-tradable sector is in a given place. And we find a strong negative correlation between the productivity and strong positive productivity and density. If we could have changed that productivity somehow endogenously, maybe what you are saying would be true, but we are not doing it in the model. But I'm very sympathetic.
Two things. One is to echo your points. In the migration data, we actually saw the low income people also moving out of central city, although at a less rate.
Mhm.
And then the second thing is, kind of in my presentation, I kind of showed that even in the high skilled remote type of jobs are also moving out of the city, the job, not the people, right?
Mhm.
So it's kind of a little bit at odd with the prediction. So of your model, because your model is predicting that these jobs are going to fill the like New York, right, Manhattan. So I'm wondering what are the assumptions that give rise to this result, and how do you make that consistent with the data?
So it's not really that remote jobs are moving towards Manhattan. I mean, some of it is that, but the distinction that is the largest is tradable versus non-tradable. And of course, there are more tradable remote jobs than non-tradable remote jobs. And the key mechanism that is driving that is that firms in very productive locations, they have greater access to workers everywhere. That's why they are hiring.
Thanks. Super interesting paper. Two sets of comments. One, at least in what you showed us here, the exogenous shift was the disutility of working from home. And you explained that if you make the exogenous shift entirely about relative productivity of work from home mode, you get odd implications. But it seems in reality, there's some of both going on. And I wonder whether a more natural experiment wouldn't be to select the mix of those two shocks so that the direct effect on productivity ended up being neutral. Okay, so there's going to be other things equal if you if you make it more attractive to work from home for utility reasons, then that I think generates a productivity reduction overall. So those two things are, so I just think there's probably another parameterization and comparative stack exercise to explore that might be more natural than either one of the two corner cases.
Right.
What you seem to have considered. Second, your model forces us to think about something which, in my understanding, the urban economics literature is usually ignored, which it's the agglomeration externalities arise from density of whom. Okay, your model has big shifts in the composition of who's in the city. Okay, and that raises the question, well, are the agglomeration externalities coming from the highly educated workers, from the less educated workers, from all of them equally, which seems unlikely. And I don't know whether as I understood it, you've just assumed that that's kind of neutral across types.
Exactly. Yep.
But that seems like a questionable implication. Maybe it didn't matter much before the pandemic happened, but now that the pandemic seems likely to shift the mix of who's in cities for reasons your model gets at, we need to think about that more carefully.
Right. So to your first question, we could do that exercise. The reason why we do one of the both is that we are basically calibrating the same parameters to the same target. And now that you're suggesting there could be another target, we could do that for sure. As far as the effect of different kinds of workers on agglomeration externalities, you're right that it's traditional in the literature to not differentiate between the two, though there has been recent research that shows that agglomeration externalities are more determined by college-educated workers than non-college-educated workers. We haven't done that. We could do that.
I had more of a kind of a nerdy comment, which is I liked that your framing of so we estimate the model and then we predict, or we see how well the predictions of the model match up to the post 2020 data. And I mean, I think it would be more useful to see those as if they were a bit more non-parametric, and if you kind of tested which of the parameters of the model are the ones that kind of make that fit be better or not, because that can really point to kind of what are the underlying economic mechanisms in that are moving things around. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so just quickly, I think the housing supply elasticities are probably a bit too high right now in the model. The Bumsnow and Hahn estimates that you're using, I think those are really, you should think of those as like long run elasticities. And I think over this period, it's probably much smaller than that. The second point is, I think the floor space is kind of fungible between office and non-office. And again, that's kind of more reasonable in the long run than I think of the period that you're looking at.
So to both of the questions, we run robustness checks using different elasticity values. They don't seem to affect the results very much. We also run a robustness check. Well, it's not a robustness check. It's a different exercise in which we don't allow conversions between types of real estate. And we see, as we see in the data as well, a strong increase in residential prices and a strong decrease in commercial prices. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah.
So it would be great if this remains uncovered.
As soon as the mic gets set up, we will hear about the international price of remote work from Alberto.
They're fine. Okay, great. Thank you. This is our question here today is what is the price of remote work? So essentially the wage of international remote work. So this is joint work with Agostina Brinati, who's a brilliant PhD student coming in the market soon from Michigan, Javier Cravino, also from Michigan, and Andres Trenik from UT Austin. We're all macro international economists, and we come to this question from the perspective is the international price of remote. I honestly learned a lot about the remote work these days. You'll see the citations to your papers. Just didn't realize we had so much, so many papers written about this. We started this project before the pandemic, actually, because we came to was already, even before the pandemic, integrating global markets. And a large fraction of jobs, as we have discussed these days, can be done remotely, even across borders, international borders. And even before the pandemic, the ICT-enabled service in trade had grown a lot. In the US, it quadrupled since the early 2000s, and is now 70% of all trade in services here. Now, and obviously, after COVID, US companies are shifting to this work from anywhere model. If you're going to hire remote workers that are a few kilometers away, why not hire them even in another country? In fact, there's a PricewaterhouseCoopers survey that a few months ago suggested that 28% of employers in the US plan to allow remote in other countries. So the question of the paper is, how are these remote wages being set? Are they different across regions and countries? Can we document that? And also, are these sensitive to international competition and international shocks? And our contribution is going to be that this analysis using new data from a global marketplace of labor. These are, call them here, large web-based job platforms, but think of these freelancer websites where people connect to, they match employers and from around the world. The work can be delivered online. So in a sense, we think this gives us a window into a globalized market for remote work that has existed already for many years. And obviously, is a rapidly growing sector, particularly after COVID. And the number of platforms we detected online has tripled in the past. And 2020 numbers, I think those are $1 billion in revenue. So let me preview the find very large wage differences across locations from after controlling for a lot of observables. We can from the platform. Wages are going to vary a lot with the workers' locations, not the employers. Analysis showing remote wages are going to be highly sensitive to foreign shocks. So the dollar wages are going to respond. Dollar exchange rates in the workers' country means a very big pass-through into the local wages. And then the wages respond very strongly to the competitors' changing wages in the platform. Okay? So let's about the platform. It's one of the largest online platforms. It has millions of users, 3 million jobs worth 1 billion posted annually. We will focus on 100,000 workers that are very active. We can detect they're active in the platform. So the platform itself specializes on remote work. They go from accountants to web developers. These are the 12 broad categories in which the data is divided. Obviously, there's a lot of workers in web, software, design. You also get a categories such as accounting. Then actually narrow sectors that we and you can see some of the distribution. But there are sort of activities that you would expect quite tradable and sort of. Does a typical platform look like? This is not necessarily one we get our data from, but they all have a similar feature. You go to a workers page and you see the workers location. They have a description of the type of work they do. You can find information on a post, how much they've earned on the platform, how many jobs they have. I see a lot of test results. It's a measure of skills that we can use to control it or not. Well, information on the website. A job history. We can see all the work they have done. We can get the wages they have paid on an hourly basis of each one of these jobs. And crucially, the location of the employer. We know where the is based, how much therefore they're getting paid. Two data sets in the paper. One is a job-based data collected before the pandemic. We call these transacted wages. And crucially, a richer data set because it tells us where the employer is based. So most of the results I'm going to show you today worker-based, like front page of the workers, and we've done that several times to see if we can detect any convergence over time. We haven't yet, but our plan is to keep on. There's some statistics I can later show. The wage is quite high, particularly from some of the workers in developing countries. Its total earnings are 6-9 times. But we do find that many of them are actually so they seem to be working full time on these platforms, and some of them appear to be doing it part time. And they show this by where are they located? Well, of the workers are in non-OECD countries, in developing countries. As the employers are more highly concentrated, particularly in the US. No? So 80% come from OECD. So you can see the platform is already clearly being used to provide labor from developing countries into developed. Now, let me first show you some raw data. We just take the information, we calculate the average wage. And what I'm doing here is plotting the difference in each one. The US, which is standing there at 1. Lower wages in all these countries are relative to the US. And what I've done here is also plotting it relative to GDP per capita. So you can see two things. The raw wage itself is taking simple average. The rate a bit than what on the basis a correlation between the two. So nations that are receiving lower wages, this could be driven by the fact that we're not controlling for worker characteristics yet, employer location. So that's what next. We're essentially running a simple regression with an employer in country E and a worker I. We have dummies for the worker's country. We have dummies for the employer's country, and all this set of specific controls, experience, ratings, everything that you saw. We could collect on the website. Just a little bit the balance here. We find that workers location is driving most of the variability. The same graph I showed you before, but now controlling for all these characteristics. The difference is so for India, find a third of the wage. It's still strongly correlated with GDP per capita. So I will. To the dispersion in GDP per capita, these seem to be far more compressed. So there's a sense in which this has already created some of the convergence we have created, but the difference is dummy for the employer. There's no variation. There's some variation, of course, but not as can do some analysis, try to see if the workers charge differently, employers are located in different countries, and they don't. They basically charge the same thing. So this is all seems to be coming where the worker, okay. We have an analysis also within the US, and we find very similar results. So bring everything to California, that would be the number one. See these big differences. This data set, this is the ask wage data set. Found this with the other one. Where it looks more compressed simply because the range of the GDP per capita here is more compressed, but the results are not so different. So this suggests that what we're finding is not necessarily an international thing. We will focus on the international dimension because it's a environment we're interested, but also let me walk you into that. This is we're gonna try to put some structure into a regression by using a very stylized model of wage determination. Well, I don't have time to get into the details, but it's to workers that country relative to the wage for sector J. That's the wage that you see here. So it depends negatively on that difference, and obviously on the index sector J across the platform. That's the W. Applied positively on locally in countries. Then you have these shifters of demand and supply. This gives us a wage for worker I that essentially has many things here, but essentially it depends on the local wage depends on the wage for the sector that is in the platform, and then you have something that is about the efficiency of the worker itself, and these are capturing demand and supply shifters at the country and sector levels. We can, with that regression that looks similar, this is capturing the changes in wage, which is what we want to estimate. Now, we don't observe the wage in the local market. Those are the wages, but we can estimate their change by looking at exchange rates and inflation within that country. That's essentially what we're doing here. And then we're gonna try to find ways, I'll show you in a second, to estimate the change of the competitors' wages, which is captured by this coefficient here. So how are we gonna do? Top equation, which is estimate and tell you how we're trying to capture this. First, we run what's called a medium exchange rate pass regression, where we, it's straightforward. We're going to look at the effect that changes in the exchange rate and the inflation rate have on the wage per worker. We're not going to impose the restriction which comes from the model that these two should be equal, the beta 1 and beta 2. So we're going to show that case. And then initially we're going to capture these competitors' wages through time fixed effect that we post in this regression. We include also specific line trends. This is important. We don't observe the workers working in a job every period. So that's why it's actually called a medium exchange rate pass-through regression. This delta, these time spells that we observe a job, jobs for the same worker over time. So we have these two time periods. No, but otherwise it's a very standard pass-through regression. How are we going to estimate these? Well, we actually have two options of doing this. These are the changes and responses to the competitors' wages. One is we can build a sector wage index within we use wages. Potentially that's has 80 issues. So the other option is to run an IV regression when we instruct the wages of the competitors by using a weighted share and inflation rates that we observe, from these workers and their countries. We know where they're from, so we can create an of that. No? So let me show you the results. These are the three equations I was describing. The first one is just focusing on the pass-through. The second one adds the effect of the competitors' wages by creating a wage index. And the third one is the result from the IB regression. They all produce very similar estimates. So let me focus on the last one. This coefficient here is telling you that a change in the exchange rate induces a relatively small change on the dollar wage on the platform. It means there's a very big change on the local currency. For example, if the rupee, since we have so many workers in India, were to fall by 10%, we would see a fall of 2.1% in the dollar wage, and obviously an increase in the rupee wage, 7.9. So actually participating in this platform is sheltering these workers from exchange rate shock they may experience. Now, this coefficient here is suggesting that there's also a very strong reaction to wages that the competitors set. So if a competitor, for example, increase that considers all the competitors, rises by 10%, then the wage rise about 7%. Also a big reaction. These results, in a sense, are actually very similar to what you find at goods. Well, emerging economies for goods prices to react quite strongly to in local currency. There's a very high pass-through to exchange rate movements, and obviously exporters tend to adjust their prices a lot to the exporters of other goods. So in this sense, the exports of services are behaving very similar to the exports of goods. Perhaps though that we observed at the beginning are much. So the next part of the paper focuses on trying to also produce a measure of offshoreability that I hope many of you will use potentially in some of your papers. You know, the literature, there are actually existing measures of offshoreability that use what we call subjective judgment. For example, you can ask people, can your job be done in a remote location, and get their perception or evaluation of that. You can also look at what they do and say, oh, if they use a computer or phone, we're going to classify that in offshoreable. Our conclusion here, you can actually use cross-border contracts. We see how many times, in principle, all the jobs in this platform are offshoreable, but we can actually see how many of them as a share are. So the approach is simply looking or classifying a job as offshore if the employer's country is different from the that are actually offshore. So let me show you a few results. We have 91 categories. I'm here. On the other hand, we have mostly legal activities that probably require some specialized knowledge in the US. And those are the ones that are still considerably offshore. So one point I want to make is that remote doesn't mean it's easily offshore. You can document that. Price measure, we have these 91 occupations that come from the platform, but we have to see. There's more disaggregated than the one, and we find that for example, look at legal in the SOC classification, you will get an average of a very dispersed number. So it suggests that for international purposes, this may not be disaggregated as anyway. The results I wanted to highlight before I finish that we can take these measures of offshoreability and look at what happens with dispersion. There's less wage dispersion in those jobs more easily offshore. So we do find some of them. So even though there's really very big difference. So main takeaways, we have this new data on a web-based platform to study remote wages. We find these large wage gaps in remote wage cross country, even of the variance in wages. So it's something about the labor market in the worker is operating, the opportunity cost worker has, The wages correlate with income per capita also very strongly. And then on the international side, we found that remote wages are very sensitive to changes in foreign exchange rates, in own exchange rates, the competitors' wages. And as I mentioned, these are actually quite, since we have historically literature has found with goods. We have these new measures of job offshore. I hope, as I said, many of you end up using. All right. So thank you so much and happy to take questions.
So I think I already have a mic, so I will ask the first one. That was fascinating. I have two questions, if I may. First, when you present the stylized facts, are these wages expressed in purchasing power parities or just in dollars?
No, these results I showed just power parities. For these, for GDP, if we could do GDP and PPP, probably also would shrink this version. Look the slope even higher, but then we should probably calculate the wages in terms of GDP.
Mainly, my question is mainly about recalculating wages into purchasing power parities, because this could be important reason why people in Philippines or India or Ukraine accept lower monetary wages than those in the US.
No, that's a great point. The PPP data or the PPP data is actually collected, or the PPP exchange rates that are used to do those calculations are collected by the ICP at the World Bank every 10 years. And we haven't been able to get more recent data, but I have other work using sort of identical goods prices that we plan to incorporate into this and use it to compare to some benchmark of a basket of goods. And you may be absolutely right. Maybe we would see significantly more convergence, or in terms of wages that account for the cost of living. That's probably what's driving it.
And the other question, if I may, when you do the measure of shareability, so your platform has like a total of 1 million workers, right? That's still, let's say, a lower number than the number of people who are employed in like offshore multinational firms like in India, Philippines, Poland, South Africa. Would be amazing to see the comparison of like the structure of occupations in this like centralized offshoring, where people actually set up like an accounting center or invoice processing, and those that are more like this disaggregated, because this is much more atomized offshoring than the corporate one.
I don't know if that data exists. If you know, or anyone here knows where we could get those measures, that would certainly be that they may have them. Yeah, that's true. Thank you. That's a great point.
And then again, building on Roger's work before, like if they like savings or something.
Yeah, no, you're right. And there's some variation. I mean, because the country effects would capture most of that, but we have some variation of countries and time zones that we could potentially use. Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah. No, great idea. Thank you.
So, great work, Alberto. Like 2 questions. So I was wondering whether there's any within country variation among workers, especially for repeat workers. Like if once the condition on the match being formed between the employer and the worker is high quality, is there like a wage convergence for that particular worker? So I think that was first question.
Okay. Good
and
point,
and the second question was like, are these, how sticky are these, firm worker matches based on exchange rate movements? So, if I'm with a really good worker, am I likely to ignore an exchange rate shock and keep with that worker? And if for a poor quality worker, maybe I'll move to a country where the exchange rate is more favorable.
Right.
So I was wondering.
That's a great point. Yeah. That absolutely right. There could be some something that affects the degree of switching that you end up doing for countries that have a lot of volatility. So great points. Yeah, I'll look into it.
This may or may not be feasible, but I was wondering if it'd be possible to do like a survey of these workers to see whether they have an understanding of like what they could get from different employers. Like, do they know that if they're like with a US employer, they could ask for more?
Right. One of the things we wondered, for example, we can't ask them, but we wonder if they probably notice this. They seem to be reacting to the wages of other workers. If we could detect any people changing the location to charge a higher job. So we couldn't find many. Apparently, these platforms are very careful to avoid that sort of manipulation of the data. No? So, but we have a few, and they do actually experience higher wages, but they could be simply moving to these countries and suddenly getting some of the advantages. But yeah, I'd love to interview. We're collecting it from publicly available information. So we can't really contact them.
Yeah, so based on my experience on Upwork, my prior is that there's 3 reasons why there's a domestic international wage gap. So the first is genuine productivity differences, right? So if that's the case, that's going to be a limit to how much you can offshore work. The second,
sorry, would that be measured by our skills indicators or our?
I don't think so. There's like kind of an intangible sense in which even if the person has lots of stars, they have lots of skills, you just get different work product from people in different countries. Right. And the second is that even
sorry, either real or perceived, even if it's a perceived.
Yeah, even if it's perceived. Yeah.
Right.
And the second is that even when they're not productivity differences, there's maybe a competitive market going on so that people are just paid lower prevailing wages for market reasons. So I think you're picking that up. That's the point you're picking up. And then if this story is true, then you'd expect more offshoring to happen in the long run as people take advantage of these wage differences. And the third one is my own sense is that there's some degree of adverse selection that's larger internationally. So there's more dispersion between the quality of different workers, and it's harder to figure out which one is a high quality worker, such that you pay them assuming the worst case scenario. And
any ideas on how we could measure that?
I think it's tough, but I'd be curious in, for example, how often there's inequality in jobs done by workers, right? So you would expect this to ameliorate over time as certification kicks in, people figure out who are the high quality workers and they should kind of run away with more jobs. So I think this third one is potentially fixable down the road.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah. And we are part of our goal. I think just the wage differences should, like you were saying, also promote a lot of workers to join, a lot of firms to hire these workers. And if these trends continue, we were expecting to see some convergence. We haven't seen much yet, but our plan is to keep on trying to detect it over time.
It's really great. I was going to make 2 comments. One very similar to Arpit. I wondered if it's like a risk premium. So you care both about the mean, but you're very sensitive to the left tail. Because I think of, in the US, I know Stanford is relaxing people moving across, but they're not allowing them to move internationally because there's this left tail nightmare that happens, that someone leaks data or something. But you could get it. I guess it's by repeatness of job and also stars or something.
Yeah. We could.
I mean, given that we could talk separately, I'm sure we have some contacts with Upwork. You could probably directly, work with them. The other thought was on the changes. I noticed you have a few people there in Ukraine and Russia, and obviously the supply of that. Some of them are obviously are not working anymore, and some of them have moved country. I don't know if it's possible to get the same people.
Yeah. So that test I was referring to, we did it a year ago, so we could see what happens. That's a great idea.
Yeah, in both countries, I think a lot of them are still working, but have relocated. It'd be interesting to see.
Yeah. And on the Upwork, I definitely take you on that. I think they actually should be advertising these results.
Right, this is online, so I don't want to be but yeah, we should totally, because it's completely in their interest as well. Right. It seems like this is a great advertisement for them because all these gains to be had. Great. We should. Do you want to? Oh, you're counting down. Go ahead, Steve.
Yep. 3 quick comments. First, my understanding of how these markets work is that many workers are actually hired through an intermediary who was designed to deal with the adverse selection problem. And I think it's an RE Stud paper that documents, especially among younger workers who are hired through an intermediary in the source country, they do get paid more. Okay, so there is a screening process that underlies this.
Right. So 15% of our sample is through agency.
Okay, so that seems like, and earlier work suggests that's an important factor in wage determination and quality control. Second,
and we're controlling it here.
Okay, but you also, it's of interest more than as a control, but as something you want to draw out in the analysis.
We tested if the sensitivity, for example, the exchange rates and other shows was different, and we didn't detect that. Right? You're gonna have to make a comment quickly. Sorry.
Second is you're measuring wage per unit time, but some of your jobs appear to like they might lend themselves to measuring wage per efficiency unit of labor supplied. So that medical translators, resume writers, I don't know whether there's information in your data set, but it would be extremely useful to reproduce it that way. Last comment really quickly. If you really want to speak to the wage responsiveness to exchange rate shocks, it'd be great to look at the dynamics and not just some contemporaneous response.
Okay, that's a great point. Thank you.
Excited to hear about work from home and the real estate apocalypse from Arpit.
The big tip is this should remain uncovered to the greatest extent as possible. So jacket pockets works perfect. Some people have to take pockets, so I can do it.
All right, thank you all for having me on the program, and thanks to Nick and all the others for organizing. This is joint work with Brenda Mitchell, who is a PhD student on the market this year from Columbia, and Steinwa Neuberg. So I don't have to motivate this too much. We all know there's a lot of remote work. The goal of our project is to explore the implications for the shift in remote work on the places that people used to work, the office. And we think this is a really important sector to understand because it's a really large asset class. So it's broadly held throughout the economy. And so the financial implications of changes in office value are really important for financial institutions, as well as for cities, which rely on property taxes and other revenue from offices and associated businesses for a lot of revenue. To study this is actually a difficult question, though, because office real estate is a sector that's sort of opaque and held through a lot of private institutions. So our approach is going to be to try to use market prices the best that we can to learn about some things associated with the office and use other new data on private office assets to extrapolate and incorporate a broader sense of the whole universe. We're going to do two things. The first is to a little bit descriptively show the shifts that have happened with commercial office demand. We're going to show there's huge changes in rent revenue. We're going to find evidence of a flight to quality, so shifting to higher quality buildings. And we're going to connect some of these changes to remote work specifically that raise the prospect that some of the office assets, particularly the older, less valuable ones, might be at risk of becoming stranded assets and less valuable in the wake of all this technological change. And then we're going to collect all this together and use an asset pricing model to explore the implications for these shifts on the value of offices, taking into account both the cash flow shocks as well as the potential risk that's changing as a result of new work practices. And this is kind of a headline figure. It's in a graph for maximum impact. So we've got the change in value for the commercial office relative to what was like before the pandemic. And we emphasize both the level shift as well as the uncertainty expressed in the blue, right? So our average estimate is that as of 2020, we think that there is a decline of about 45% in office value. We think it's pretty persistent on average going out over time. But again, there's a lot of uncertainty here that corresponds to whether or not remote working practices are really going to be persistent or not. Okay, so let's just start by just showing you descriptively some of the trends in office use. This is something that probably a lot of you have seen over time. This comes from Castle. So they're counting office visits based on turnstile entries, so how often people are physically walking into office. And you kind of see that there has been this huge shock. And so even after a little bit of a Labor Day recovery, we see that in New York City, for example, less than half of the people that were coming into the office on any particular day appear to be showing up right now. And it's a very similar pattern across many cities in the United States. When we look at leasing revenues, we're drawing from a new data source called CompStack, which really hasn't been used too much in the literature, but we think provides a really great view of what's going on with office leases. So we think we're kind of introducing this kind of new data set that is allowing us to look really broadly at what's kind of happening to this office sector. And we measure the leasing revenues, right? So the total leasing revenues that are going on in the whole sector, we see pretty strong declines of about 18% that are going on through about May of 2020, and a little bit of a smaller decline for the top tier of the market, which we define as A+ buildings. So one thing that's really helped to insulate the office sector from a lot of these shifts is the staggered nature of leases, right? So leases are long-term, and that means that only a small fraction of tenants, about 30%, have actually had to make an active leasing decision in the first 2 years of the pandemic. Those tenants that did sign often signed short-term leases. So what it means is that in the coming years, we're actually going to face even more of a shift as we're going to see expirations both from long-term leases signed before the pandemic, as well as new short-term leases signed during the pandemic. So we think this is just really a slow burning phenomenon, that it was kind of really hard to get a sense of what was going on with the office because of the insulated nature of these office leases. But we think that we're going to see much bigger impacts as more and more tenants are making active space decisions. When we do look at what did happen for the tenants that did make a choice, we see that leasing activity just fell off a cliff. So this is just very simple and raw data. What is happening with the total square footage of leases signed annually? There's a very stable pattern of about 250 million square leases signed every year happening before the pandemic. And there's been a 70–80% drop in the quantity of new office leases that have been signed during the pandemic, right? So this means that that small fraction of tenants that have made a space decision have really not been renewing very often. And so there's been a huge drop off in the overall lease quantity. And we see that in the vacancy rates for individual cities, right? So on the left here is Manhattan. This is the occupancy rate for offices, right? And you see that we're right now at sort of the lowest occupancy rate for Manhattan office we've seen in over 30 years, right? And this has happened in a very brief period just over the pandemic, reflecting the very low rate at which tenants have actually been renewing space. And in San Francisco here, we see like an even greater drop off. So this is now, in some data reports as high as 25% vacancy in San Francisco. So just huge shifts in what are going on in some of these central business districts in terms of overall office occupancy. We're also able to look at this at the tenant level, right? So collapsing all the leases up to a particular tenant and then asking how often that tenant is renewing. So at 100, right, would be a tenant that's renewing 100% of their pre-pandemic space quantity. And one thing you see here is that there's really a long tail of firms that are not too large, that didn't have too much space, that are really getting rid of a lot of space. And so one of the things that's kind of been happening is that the market's been sort of held up by what's going on the right side of the graph, these kind of Microsoft, Facebooks, Apples, these really large tenants. So these are the companies that are kind of in the news, people are kind of talking about them. And these really large tenants have kind of been holding up the market a little bit, but that's sort of, disguising the fact that there's a really long tail of smaller firms that are kind of exiting the office market. When we look at prices, so we've got net effective rents here. So this is a measure of rents that takes into account all the different components of leasing terms. So just like with your apartment rent, there's going to be possible concessions and other terms that go into it and escalation clauses over years. So we're accounting for all of that in this net effective rent measure. And so we see that the prices of these leases is declining a fair amount by about 16% in New York City relative to pre-pandemic values. And we also kind of see evidence of a flight to quality here in New York, where the best evidence for this is making this point where we're comparing the net effective rent for young buildings and older buildings. And so these younger buildings are actually rebounding quite quickly. And so they're having even higher rents paid for these newer buildings, which are higher quality and help firms bring workers back into the office. Whereas it's those older buildings that are not seeing that same rent change that are, again, more at risk of being in that stranded office class. Okay, so next, this is kind of a new section here where we've tried to connect these office demand shifts to remote work practices in particular. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use one of the job platform ladders where we are classifying job posts, and we're just looking at whether or not the job post is for a fully remote position or not, right? So this gives us at a tenant level a fraction of how many job posts are for fully remote positions versus in-person positions. And we use at the tenant level a regression comparing how often that tenant is advertising for remote positions against what are they doing with their change in space demand. And what we find is that a firm that moves to 10% of their job postings being fully remote has a 4 to 5 percentage point decrease in their space demand, right? So this is telling us in the cross section, the more firms use remote workers, the less likely they are to demand space. What we've also done is look at hybrid work. And so what we did here is we went through the 200 of the largest firms, and we actually classified their remote working plans. So we had 2 sets of people on Upwork go through and classify all these different firms back to office plans into 3 categories: in-person, hybrid, and fully remote. And then for each of these classes, we're asking how that firm changes their office demand over the pandemic, right? So the in-person firms, the ones that are planning to go back fully in person, so these are more likely to be like, like Goldman Sachs and other financial firms, for example. They don't have too much of a change in their office demand. However, there's really large shift for fully remote firms, those that are going completely remote. And there's even a pretty large shift for hybrid firms, the ones that are planning on going in a few days of the week. So what we think is going on here is that even though hybrid work doesn't allow you the same level of flexibility as fully remote, it still allows for a lot of space savings as firms use techniques like hoteling and schedule and overlapping shifts and so forth. Our classification also looked at the number of days that the firm is planning to be back in the office, right? So we're comparing fully remote firms to no days back in the office, firms that are going pretty more heavily, 4 to 5 days in the office, and firms that are planning some intermediate mix, right? 1 to 3 days back in the office. And we see kind of a relationship that the firms that are planning more in-person utilization are more likely to demand space, whereas the firms that are planning on coming in less often also have a greater decline in their office demand. So this all kind of lines up and tells us that there seems to be something about remote work which is influencing firms' demand for office space, and so it's contributing to these large shifts that we're kind of seeing in the last couple of years. So the next thing we're going to do is try to put these pieces together and ask, what are the implications of this shift in office demand for the value of commercial offices, right? So there's a big shock to cash flows. There are potentially also shocks to the risk that are going on here. And so we want to kind of combine all that together and come up with a figure for the dollar shock to commercial offices. So to do that is actually a little bit complicated because of the institutional details of how commercial real estate works, right? We have all of these leases in place that represents the revenue side for buildings. We have a lot of costs that we want to think about as well. And so we want to kind of accommodate all of those rich institutional details. So the way we do so is model buildings as a portfolio of leases. And we kind of do the Calvo thing and say there's going to be a fraction of your leases that are going to come due every single period. Those leases are then going to go into vacancy, and you can do two things. You can take your expiring leases and renew them at the new market rate, right? So there's going to be a state parameter for what the market rent is going to be. And you can take all your existing vacant space and also lease that out at the market rate, right? So you can basically renew your currently expiring leases. The ones that you don't renew are going to add to your stock of vacant leases, and your total vacant leases every period also gets a new tenant at some rate. So that's going to be on the revenue side. Then for costs, we also have variable and fixed costs. So if I have less space utilization in my building, I also need to spend less on the cost side. And those are also going to depend on aggregate states that I'll come to in just in a second. So the way we kind of think about these states is to first start with a benchmark where we have expansions and recessions, right? So that's pretty straightforward to think about times when the economy is growing, times when the economy is contracting, and those are going to correspond to different shocks to office demand. What's more complicated is to think about how remote work has changed the situation. And so what we're going to do is have a kind of framework where we're basically going to have a working from home recession and a working from home expansion that are going to reflect two new states that the economy can explore. And so the idea is that we just had a pretty low probability of entering into this work from home world before the pandemic, right? And now that we're in it, the whole challenge is to think about how persistent is this work from home state going to be? What are the odds that we're going to come back to in person or stay in the work from home? So we're going to calibrate that probability from REIT data. The way we're going to do that is we're going to look at 3 New York City-centric REITs, Russell Green and Empire State Trust. And our whole valuation exercise is predominantly focused on New York because it's the largest office market, and we're all from New York. And from these 3 companies, these are basically publicly traded stocks that track the value of a lot of commercial office real estate, right? And this is predominantly the high end of commercial offices. We're getting really the best buildings in this portfolio. And we asked, what is the change in value that these stocks experience from before the pandemic to a year afterwards? We think that going about a year is enough to kind of give us a sense of the informational shock that the market was digesting at that point. And what we're kind of doing is using that decline in the value of the equity. We delever that to get a sense of the asset value decline. So basically the value of the assets held in these 3 portfolios went down by about 23%. And we can map that to a sense of how persistent this work from home shock is going to be. And the key intuition behind that is the more persistent this work from home shock is going to be, the more we expect the stock prices of these REITs to go down, right? If this is not a persistent shock at all, it should have no impact on the valuation. The more persistent it's going to be, the more we expect the valuation to go down. And so that for us pins down a specific value for this parameter. But of course, we do other robustness exercises to see how our estimates would change. So this persistence parameter about 0.8 tells us that from year to year, there's about an 80% chance we're going to stay, persist in this particular state. So if you look at that over, like a 9-year horizon, that actually implies only a, 25% chance that we have remained in this state, over time, right? So it's a fairly sticky phenomenon, but still will imply over a long enough horizon that you're going to exit the work from home world at some point. So that's kind of the states. Then we look at our discount rates and how we understand risk. So the way we kind of think about this intuitively is build a portfolio that goes long Zoom stock and short Carnival Cruises. Take that portfolio and regress that against these REIT stock prices, right? The correlation or the beta on that type of exposure is going to measure the extent to which commercial office is exposed to this new risk factor that has to do from working from home. So commercial office wasn't really correlated to a portfolio that looked like this before the pandemic, and it starts to be correlated during the pandemic, which we think reflects this new risk. And so that's like an additional discount rate that we're going to incorporate here. And the basic intuition is that we're going to want to incorporate the fact that offices are more risky now because they're exposed to this new source of aggregate risk. All right, so there's kind of the basics of our calibration for New York City. So again, we've got these 4 states: expansions, recessions, work from home expansions, work from home recessions. And the key things we want to calibrate have to do with how rent growth is changing and how offices are getting renewed in these different states. So for expansions and recessions, it's a pretty straightforward process because we can just look historically and see how offices have done in these 2 states. What's more challenging is to think about what's going to happen in work from home expansions and work from home recessions. So we kind of intuitively think of the work from home recession as what happened in 2020, right? When there was this big negative shock both to the economy as well as to working from home practices. We kind of think of 2021 as a work from home expansion, which was more economic growth, but still featured work from home. And who knows what this year is going to bring. And so we pick parameters for rent growth and renewal shares for these 2 states that are intended to sort of match vacancy rates that we think are reasonable and kind of in line with what we observe in the data. So we also take a stance on supply. So we measure supply as well historically, take into account depreciation in ways that are consistent with some stable long-term pattern for net operating income, the revenue in offices. Okay, so here's basically a takeaway from that exercise. Again, we're starting with a value of 100 for the initial value of the office before the pandemic. We have this large decline in 2020 that comes from the shock that happens in the work from home recession state, right? And that shock is even greater when we look at the non-A+ sector of the market, right? The lower quality office space. So a little bit of a recovery in 2021 as we move to that work from home expansion state. And then going forward, we let the model run, and all these lines are going to reflect future situations, future states, which incorporate different scenarios for expansions, recessions, returning back to the office, staying remotely working, right? So we really emphasize both aspects of this estimation, both the headline number that there's a big decline in office value, as well as the spread and dispersion for how this evolves in the future, reflecting uncertainty and risk about how remote work plans are going to go. This is what the A+ sector looks like. So this has not as large of a decline, about 27% decline. That's kind of in line with what we observed for commercial REITs, and overall doesn't seem to have as much of an impact from the pandemic, reflecting greater relative demand for A+ office buildings compared to lower quality office buildings. Okay, so this also helps out Johannes, who is looking for more estimates across the country. But this is basically, so again, our whole exercise is really focused on New York. You can see it's by far the largest office market. We also have estimates here all around the country. And what we've kind of done basically is take the cash flow shock, the leasing revenue shock here, and we get a dollar estimate of the value by incorporating the discount rate shock that we observe in New York City, assuming that that's the same around the country. So while there are regional, something interesting is that there is a negative leasing revenue shock in every office market in the country, right? This really is a kind of a nationwide shock that we're kind of experiencing. So what are the implications of this, right? Well, if you kind of aggregate some of our estimates across the whole country, again, we've done a little bit of disaggregation in that exercise, but if we just assume everything is stable across the country, we get an overall shock of, something like $500 billion, so pretty large valuation shock. Conversion is a huge issue. We can talk about that maybe more in the discussion. We think it's really complicated and difficult for a lot of reasons, but there is certainly interest in trying to make this happen. We see other evidence in financial markets. So what's basically going on here is these are credit default swaps tracking the performance of securitized commercial loan debt. And these things are starting to go down, reflecting the fact that the market sentiment for default on these commercial loans is starting to rise. And finally, we're worried about the broader implications of the shock to commercial offices or cities because of how urban governments are reliant on these office properties to generate revenue in order to sustain their operations. And so we're worried about the long-run implications for city government. So thank you all very much. Looking forward to the comments.
Okay. We're gonna both fight it out. Thank you, Arpit. Two questions. One is you had a slide where you were looking at the different metro areas. I didn't see Miami there, but I mean, you probably saw like Citadel moving their space to or at least setting up. And so I was just kind of curious about reallocation. And then really quickly on second clarification was around how much can firm size and like industry and some of those observables explain the demand, whether it's in New York City or some of these other metro areas. Like you observe characteristics about the underlying firm and their lease, I suppose. But anyways, I'll let you take these.
So we don't have Miami here just because unfortunately our data provider, that's one of the places they don't have as good coverage. But I'm totally with you. It is an important booming market. And I think your other question was about, can we run a regression, let's say, incorporating a lot of different characteristics about firm, their size and other attributes. Yeah, I've looked at some of these regressions. So size is definitely one of the factors that seems to be important. Just the number of leases that are scheduled to expire is really important, right? If I'm insulated from the shock because my leases are locked in, I'm not going to do anything by design. So yeah, we can push on that further, I think, and look at more characteristics.
Have more kind of clarification and maybe a comment. So is this are these offices including some buildings like offices from essential sectors, like these industries that were defined as essential during the COVID? And would it be relevant to specifically look at those ones among the less likely to be the working from home offices to see whether there is more increase there as well?
Yeah, so this is inclusive of all different kinds of office properties. We also have retail leases in here that we've looked at separately. So retail maybe gets a little bit closer at the essential worker component, and there we see that retail leases are very sensitive to what's going on with the neighboring area, right? So retail leases in urban districts are seeing much bigger shocks compared to retail elsewhere, which I think other research is also consistent with. We also tried a lot to look at whether maybe back to Chris's point as well, whether other like tenant characteristics predicted kind of some of these shifts, right? Do other working from home scores or things like that influence it? And we really didn't find much. And I think the reason is that regardless of what your industry happens to be, the office that you have for your location kind of by definition, or not by definition, but is very likely to be remotable, right? So I can be in an industry or a sector where there is a lot of in-person presence, but the office that I have is much easier to turn remote because that's the component of my business operations that's being done in an office that could potentially be done at home. So we actually didn't really find much variation there, right? Between industry classifications based on remote working scores and things like that.
There have been plenty of discussion about, we'll use Office only for meetings and team building, and then we'll do individual work somewhere else. I don't know how much information you have about those spaces, but do you see that, offices that have less cubicles and more common spaces are more leased? And also somewhat related to that, do you see increase in leases by companies like WeWork that offer common spaces?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't observe those granular aspects of the office design. I think that'd be a really fascinating thing to look at. I think WeWork actually decreases in their office demand in our sample. It's actually one of the largest tenants in the sample. I think they actually went down in their overall space demand. Maybe a little bit surprising. You'd think they should actually be doing relatively well. they have separate things going on. But broadly, I hear your point that you could imagine a lot of repurposing and changing the nature of what the office is towards those other purposes. And certainly there are lots of anecdotes and stories we've heard of that are very consistent with that.
The descriptive portion was beautiful because it aligns so well with what we have in the business response survey. So we asked about, have you decreased your physical footprint over the course of the pandemic? And then small businesses are about twice as likely to have reported that they decreased their physical footprint. And then also relocation, it was more likely. We also have some expectations questions about going into the future. Do you expect to decrease your physical footprint? And then the second part is when you cross it with their reporting on remote work at that establishment, it's those conditional on reducing your physical footprint, they have about twice as likely to have a job that's remote work at those establishments. And so we can see that in the surveys. That's I think that's really cool because it matches up with a lot of the results you have there.
Yeah, that's really cool. We have to connect more with the work you're doing in that survey. One like quick thing I'd note about the small versus large tenant is, I think a little bit of the media narrative is very focused on what is Goldman Sachs doing, what is JP Morgan doing, but you have to realize there's all these other firms that are not in that bracket, right? And we did kind of a back of the envelope calculation that for a typical firm in New York City, you're spending about $20,000 per employee to maintain your office space, right? And so it's a large expense. And so there are a lot of firms for which that is worth it, right? But there are also a lot of firms for which that doesn't necessarily make financial sense. And so we think there's a lot of sort of silent quitting of the office going on across a large section of the economy.
I find the whole thing is fascinating, but I find that the pricing decision especially really fascinating. That it's the quantity that's adjusted and not the price. And I was wondering whether you could look at certain characteristics, like are offices that may be less convertible or more convertible, do they have stickier prices? Or offices that maybe have more, where there's more relationships, where you're sort of worried about setting comps for other leases, whether those maybe have stickier prices? I think those would be interesting things to explore.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that, it's been documented a little bit in the literature before. There's basically nominal rigidity with respect to these lease prices a little bit. There are several reasons I think you can think of that are contributing to that. And I take your point, we could probably test a little bit some of this in the data. I think some stories you often hear, one sets a new comp for the building, right? So then all my tenants are going to want to lower to that price. And so if I'm trying to maintain market power within a building, then I kind of want to restrain that way. So maybe that would result in a test of how many expirations are there in a building. Maybe that influences the degree to which I downgrade my rent or something like that. You're also worried about the tenant composition. I'm a high quality building. I don't want these low quality tenants in my high quality building. And then just because it's a long-term commitment, I don't necessarily want to lock someone in at the first available price. There's also covenants is like a separate issue, which can make this more hard for contractual reasons.
So one quick point, Rob, it's super cool. I'm also wondering whether the valuation exercise should account for expectations of startups, just because anecdotally, there are lots of startups which are going all remote. And whenever they meet not in offices, but in offsite locations. And there's a valuation exercise we ran actually, which showed why they're doing that, because the owner retains more equity at IPO. And I wonder, you're working with existing large and small firms, but what about startups starting now, and what's the future expectation of office space for those startups?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one thing I'd kind of emphasize is when you think about all these sort of leases, represents an important form of operational leverage for companies, especially startups, right? Because they may not have a lot of debt or other commitments in other dimensions, but if they're paying a lot of money for the office, it's very dilutive to the founder, as you're saying, because it's cash out of hand. So I totally agree with your point that this should be very impactful for startups. And then if you think in the long run that tomorrow's companies are going to be today's startups, I think we may have a very different dynamic around how office work operates.
Yeah, thanks. I believe the operating costs of maintaining a building have gone up for any given occupancy rate due to the increases in need for high quality ventilation, sanitation, and so on. So if that's happening at the same time, and if it's a significant factor, and if I understand your exercise right, it may lead you to somewhat misinterpret the implications of the asset value decline for the implied probability of a return to work from home. So I didn't get the details, but I gather you don't have such a shift in your models, that kind of shock? And if so, I think it's going to affect your estimate of the model plus data implied probability of the return to non-work from home. So that seems something worth thinking about. Second, on the ventilation point, I think one reason the young buildings are more successful is they already have good ventilation, whereas many of the older buildings don't. And it's very expensive to bring their ventilation up to kind of good standards. We know now that ventilation is a critical thing to reduce the risk of the transmission of COVID and presumably other infectious diseases. Do you know something about the ventilation quality of these older buildings? And if so, is that significantly related to either their occupancy rates or to the size of the asset valuation, revaluation that they've experienced? It'd be interesting to look at those things.
That's a great point. We've thought about that, and unfortunately, we just don't have a lot of data on, especially that attribute of ventilation. I feel it's like a whole under-discussed issue around the whole pandemic. And so, yeah, I wish we'd, I'd love to do more on that. The way we sort of thought about it so far is that we kind of view that as a conservative estimate for the value because we're not accounting for the additional value drop that might happen if we also account for the rising cost. But I take your point that also influences our persistence measure, and we can think about how sensitive those assumptions might be to that.
Yes, I'll try. I'll try.
Like
We're delighted to hear from Ludmila about the new shape of the VC industry.
Thank you for having me here. So today I will present our joint work with Caroline Genk from Paris Dauphine Universities, who is also here in the audience today, with Silvia Dalla Fontana from University of Lugano and Swiss Finance Institute, and Heidi Rashidi Ranjbar from Michigan Ross. And I would like to thank organizers for including our paper in the conference program, also because it gave me the opportunity to see my co-author Caroline in person. Before this conference, authors of this paper met each other in person just once before. So this is really the result of remote work.
That's above media.
So our paper is called From In-Person to Online, a New Shape of the VC Industry. And here we will talk about VCs. And VCs are not like many other financial intermediaries because they invest in very early stage companies about which very little tangible information, such as financial statements or sales track record, is available. Therefore, when making their financial decisions or investment decisions, venture capitalists have to rely on soft information about startups. The example of soft information would be the understanding of motivation of founders or the feeling of trust towards them. And because this information cannot be easily summarized in a numeric score and easily transferred through distance, in-person interactions between VC, their potential investment considered crucial for the VC industry success. VCs also spend a sizable work week networking with founders and other players of the VC industry. And also this need for interaction explains the fact that while in many industries that have a better access to hard information, we see the increasing geographical spread of activity, VC investments have been characterized by strong geographical clustering that facilitates face-to-face interactions. Interactions became a norm in the VC industry. In this paper, we're trying to revisit this assumption of the necessity of interpersonal interactions for the VC industry success. Typically, we try to understand how the interruption of those in-person interactions would change the VC investment behavior with respect to the geography of the investment, characteristics of their portfolio companies, the way they form syndicates, and also in terms of the performance of their investment. And we try to answer those questions by sudden interruption in in-person communications that was driven by the pandemic. And we try to see how VCs change their behavior face-to-face interactions replaced by online meetings. And we also see that VCs admit COVID shock stressed their routine. Because, for example, one of the partners in Sequoia venture capital firm says that I think the biggest challenge is the inability to go visit somebody, to walk around their office, to get a feel for their culture. Before giving details of the analysis, I will give the overview of our results. So first, in our analysis, we focused on the distance between venture capital investors and their portfolio companies. One of the main consequences of the COVID-induced environment is that distance became less constraining, because now whether investors firms are nearby each other or far away, they communicate in the same way online. So this collection of soft information was not anymore facilitated by the proximity. So we expected that VC investors would start investing farther away. Sorry, I didn't choose correctly my closing, so I have to make the microphone works. So we exactly find that the distance between venture capital investors and their investment targets increases by up to 50%. And we also see that investors are less likely to invest in their own state of location. Next, we wanted to explore whether VCs are trying to compensate for this lack of in-person due diligence with adjusting the characteristics of their investment targets. And we find that VCs start investing in more mature companies, and we also find that they start appointing fewer directors on the boards of companies. And both of those characteristics, older age and fewer before the pandemic, were characteristics of more distant. Therefore, this finding makes us to conclude that maybe this is the indication that online interaction fully substitute for in-person interactions. So next, what we did is to try to explore what other he can navigate this new environment. And networks have been considered very important in the VC industry. So we move on exploring how VCs now form syndicates. So first of all, we find that VCs are now more likely to invest as a part of a syndicate and not to invest alone. We also find that the distance between syndicate members is increasing. Now we also find that nearby the portfolio company, there are fewer VCs. So we use the radius of 50 kilometers. So we see that fewer VCs are now located within 50 kilometers around the company. But it seems like VCs are leveraging their network because at least one of them will be located. We see that while the average probability for VC investors to be experts in the industry in which they decreases, one of the is more likely to be an expert in the portfolio company industry. And we also see that they tried with as many old, already known partners as before the pandemic. And finally, with some preliminary results, we show that those adjustments that VCs do seem to be working well because we do not observe a poor quality of investment that were done online post-pandemic rather than before the pandemic when in-person interactions were possible. And with these findings, we are contributing to 4 main streams of literature. Literature on the role of soft information in financial markets, venture capital literature, of course, literature exploring the role of online communications and remote work. And we still have to cite a lot of papers here that we learned about at this conference. And the literature on the COVID-19 shock, especially with regard to venture capital industry and entrepreneurship. So now a little bit more details of how we did, how we found those results. We focus on venture capital investments done by VC-based or US-based venture capital funds into US-based startups. We use 2 popular data sets on venture capital investing, Refinitiv and PitchBook. Our period covers time from May 2008 to December 2021. And we assume that the COVID shocks comes in March 2020, when most of the US states introduced COVID-related restrictions. And we only focus on those investments that were the investments done by VC funds that were the first investment in the company. So we really focus on the selection stage of investment process and not on the post-investment value-adding activities. And among those investments, we only look at the or early stage investments. The typical regression specification that we use in our analysis, here it is used for the analysis of distance. It looks like that. So our dependent variable is a natural logarithm of distance between venture capital investor and portfolio company. Well, we measure this distance based on the zip codes of headquarters of venture capitalists and of the startup. And we include the range of the main independent variable is, of course, post-COVID, which is a dummy variable equal to 1 if the deal was done after February 20 and 0 otherwise. We include the range of controls for the deal characteristics and also fixed effects for the stage of VC investments, so seed or early stage, for the state of the company location and for the industry of company. And in our preferred specification, we also include VC firm fixed effects. And including those fixed effects, it helps us to concentrate on the average change within VC investor portfolio rather than to look at the compositional changes among the VCs in our sample. In the first results, I already mentioned, we find that in the cross-section of without VC fixed effect, we find that the distance between a venture capitalist and portfolio company increases by up to 51%. And when we include VC firm fixed effect, the increase in distance is still sizable, 30%. And we also find that VCs are now less likely to invest in their own state. We also wanted to understand what this increase in distance means. So to construct this graph, what we did is we just took all the investments done in the pre-COVID period, and we split them by deciles of the industry or distance, sorry, and we recorded the limits of each distance bucket. Basically, here within the radius of 3 kilometers from the VC investor, we have 10% of deals, another 10% of deals from 3 to 8, etc. So the red line shows this distribution of deals in those geographical limits before the pandemic. And the blue bars show the same distribution within the same geographical limits, but already after the pandemic. So we see that relatively fewer deals are now happening closer to VCs and more of them far away. We also recognize that pandemic didn't only stress VC investment process. We also understand that it significantly reshaped the whole economy. So here we're trying to rule out at least a few explanations that might drive in our results. So first, we assume that some regions could receive more VC investment just because they happen to host some industries that benefited or suffered less from the pandemic. So in some of our regressions, we include controls for state or industry growth. Second, we also think that some regions could receive more VC investment because they were already on the growing trend of entrepreneurial activity. And here we draw for the trend in the new business applications. And finally, a lot of VC funds received a lot of money inflow right before the pandemic. So the pandemic characterized by a lot of VCs having a lot of cash in their pocket. So we are trying to rule out the explanation that it might be increased local competition for deals due to big amounts of money available locally that induces VCs to invest farther away. So we control for this inflow of money into funds in all our, and none of those controls that we try to add fully explains the increase in distance that we find. We see some correlation with those controls, but it doesn't remove significance of our post-COVID variable. So after we establish that now investments are located farther away, where are they located? See, there is a slight decrease in the probability to invest within the state of California. However, of course, with VC effects, it loses its significance. But we also see that now VCs are less likely to invest in hub companies located in typical entrepreneurial hubs, San Francisco, Boston, and New York. And next, we give examples of the post-COVID allocation of investments by VCs that are located in the state of California. So here we can see some kind of direction of the investments from California to areas. The darker blue areas show those counties in which VCs invested both before and after the pandemic, while red, here it looks like brown areas, show those counties in which VCs invested the first time post-pandemic. So we see that there is some spread of activity in the counties surrounding big entrepreneurial hubs, but at the same time, we see some new areas appearing quite far away from them. We conclude that even though VCs somehow redistribute their investment across geography, they still do it in small steps. We try to see how VCs change their investment selection criteria, and we see that their new investment targets look older, even when they're located quite close to the VC investor. And here we also look at the number of directors appointed to the boards of those companies right after the investment. So here we were thinking, okay, now in those new conditions, VCs might want to improve monitoring of companies, so they would appoint more directors. At the same time, prior literature was telling us that because the monitoring of distant companies is more costly, also for distant companies, VCs usually appoint fewer directors. And here, our result is an explanation that maybe because the monitoring is still costly through online means of communication, or it cannot be as effective, they still appoint fewer directors on board. Next, we see how VCs syndicate their deals. And again, as I mentioned already in the summary, we see that VCs are now more likely, meaning with VC fixed effects at 13 or 15% more likely to syndicate deals rather than to invest alone. We also see that the distance among syndicate members increases. And here we see that there are fewer VCs located within 50 kilometers away from the portfolio company. However, when we look at the probability to have at least one local VC who is located nearby the company, we see that there is no change. So there is still at least one VC that is located in the proximity of the company. Here we look at the probability to invest with old syndicate partners, meaning with VCs who they already knew before the pandemic and with whom they collaborated before. And we see that there is at least as many VCs in the syndicate with whom they invested before. So they don't start investing with unknown partners. And finally, here we also look at one of the aspects of being concentrated in the history of the portfolio company. And we see that on average, if we just look at all the pairs of VCs and companies, VCs are less likely to be focusing on the industry of the portfolio company. At the same time, there is more likely to be at least one VC in the syndicate who will be expert in the industry. And finally, we would like to understand whether those mechanisms that the VCs are implementing help their investments to perform as well. We admit that since there are very little time that passed after the pandemic, and usually it takes for a company at least 7 years to go to IPO or M&A on average, and we have only 2 years, those results should be considered as a preliminary result, but still we would like to see what is happening with those companies. So we also look at the probability to raise a second round of financing and the probability of fast exits within 18 months. And in terms of the probability of raising follow-up financing, we see that those companies that receive investment post-pandemic are actually more likely to receive a follow-up investment from VCs. And in terms of exits within 18 months post-investment, we see that there is no significant difference, at least consistent significant difference between investment that got their financing in post-pandemic period, likely online, and ones that received it before the pandemic, when in-person interactions were possible. And just to conclude, in this paper, try to understand how we see when their traditional model is stressed by the pandemic. If you start investing further, implications for the geography of knowledge spillovers. We also see that VCs adjust their investment selection criteria, meaning that online interactions might be not perfectly substituting for in-person interactions. We also see that VCs leverage their network more, suggesting the increasing importance of venture capital networks post-pandemic. And those investment mechanisms seem to be working, because we see that those investments that were done online perform worse than the ones done before. And we believe that those results also are relevant to other industries that heavily rely on soft information, just as venture.
Sure. Yeah. So I had a couple questions / comments, and one is how much. I mean, it would be great to know how much of this is coming from really changes in the VC behavior versus changes in the startup behavior. Are they themselves locating farther away? And I think your stuff about VCs investing in older startups on it kind of points to the direction that it's really the VC's behavior that is changing. But I mean, I think if you could say or find some more evidence on which one of the two sides of the market is really moving, that could be useful. And I think my other big comment was, do you know anything about the quality of the information? So for example, are valuations more accurate or more or less volatile before the pandemic? I mean, there's going to be an important market component there, but kind of if you could say something about how this distance impacts valuations, the accuracy of those valuations, I think that would be super interesting for this particular market.
Sure. So I will reply right first. So the first comment is we are perfectly aware of it, so we completely internalize your concern. And I think some of the people with whom we already talked during the conference will know that we're very interested in potentially exploring this channel, that it's actually entrepreneurs who are moving away to the suburbs. And now, if before they could establish the company in San Francisco, now they're in suburbs or maybe in their hometown somewhere in other state. We're very open to any kind of recommendations about which kind of data we would be able to use in order to test it. So one of the suggestions we got about using data on migration, for example, inflow into some states. So it's definitely not going to be perfect, but it will give some indication about where people are moving. And regarding the second comment, it's a great idea, and I think we really should test that. We still didn't do that.
Really interesting presentation. Big question is how much of the pandemic-induced shift towards more distant investing will persist. So a simple first start to that is to take your specification and add to it 3 time periods: pre-pandemic, lockdown period, post-lockdown period. And then you want to look at the difference between the post-lockdown period and the pre-pandemic to get some sense of whether there's likely to be a persistent ongoing effect of this shock. A variant on that is to try to look to exploit differences across the VC funders in the extent to which they moved to more distant investments during the lockdown phase, and then relate that to whether they continued to stand out in that dimension after the lockdown phase. This is like forced experimentation, re-optimization of behavior, which Nick, Jose, and I have stressed in a very different setting. And it seems like something similar could be happening in your setting. And that would be quite useful to investigate. And I think you have all the data to do it.
Great comments. Thank you very much. So the first comment, unfortunately, we didn't include. We have an event study graph by half-year periods before and after the pandemic. And what we see is that in the first half of 2020, there is increase in distance, but it's actually smaller than the following increases in distance. So it seems that in the very beginning, they were still very cautious about where to invest, or maybe they still invested in some companies about which, like the completed investment decisions, about which completed investments about which they made decisions before. So this was still a slower moving period, but then we see that it still persists in the end of 2021 at least. We are going to increase our sample since now we have at least half more year of data, and we're going to see for sure.
That suggests that the shock has induced permanent changes in behavior.
Yes. So, and regarding the second comment about exploiting heterogeneity between the types of VC investors, this is a great comment. The only thing that we explored is heterogeneity, for example, in distance among sectors in which VCs invest. And not surprisingly, we see the biggest increase in distance in internet and software. At the same time, some hardware, even though the sample is a bit small, we see even a slight decrease in distance. So there is definitely also, and in previous regressions, we also can see that there is a difference between specifications sometimes with VC fixed effect and without VC fixed effect, meaning there's also some compositional change that has slightly different effect than the one that we're concentrating on at the moment. So this is a good avenue to explore.
I thought it was super interesting. I'm sure that a lot of the VCs would love to see this as well. 2 thoughts. One is, this is like, you know, academic drawing an anecdote, but living out here, I know lots of people who are in VCs, and they were saying no longer, but at the end of last year, they'd say there was like so much money flooding into VCs. They were saying like reverse pitches were common. So at least 2 friends of ours, who's like a husband and wife couple that both in VCs, were saying now, rather than firms coming to VCs to pitch their idea, VCs will be pitching to firms because there's just so much money. And this other guy I remember saying he just can't invest in enough companies. So that was a 2021 thing. So one thing is to control for that. That may vary by VC. I don't know if you look at those that have grown a lot. So there's like some VCs that just have all this money, they're just basically desperate to invest. They run out of local ideas. They just start spraying it around the place. And my guess is those firms that have grown a lot in size, or maybe those that did really well just before the pandemic, so have a good track record, you could kind of maybe break down.
Yeah, this is a great idea, and we controlled for some form of it, but not at the individual VC level, at the state level. So we looked where VC is located. So if VC is located in California, we looked at the inflow of capital in the year before the analyzed deal. But most probably it makes much more sense to explore the individual VC level. So looking at their dry powder, whether those that have too much money actually go there. Maybe not everyone has that much money, but yeah, there should be.
The timing is going to be great if you keep collecting data, because the money all just dried up within the space of like 3 months. So you're going to have a very nice discontinuity. The other thing, I guess, was very related to the last two comments was there's loads of startups doing work from home type stuff, and they're probably more likely to be remotely located. I mean, I think it's kind of consistent with this. Again, it's interesting to see how it pans out, because I think these work from home startups tend to be all over the country. And so they're probably less locally set up, but I mean,
yes. So again, another thing, just very.
I was going to say, do you know anything about who they invest in? Can you tell?
Sorry, excuse me. Here, it's not. Remove this. So here we're looking at the sectors in which they are more likely to invest. So we see that they're more likely now to invest in the internet and less likely to invest in consumer and hardware. So again, probably this is very consistent. Internet companies are the ones that can work remotely more effectively, while consumers probably not as likely.
Yeah, so if you have any information on the company, you could do kind of a, just scrape or just look at what they talk about they're doing, and if they talk about remote or work from home. Do you have any information on the companies they're investing in?
We have information on their industry, the date they were funded and founded.
Like the
Some
website.
description probably we can find.
Yeah, if you have like the website, you could probably figure out.
Website, I think.
We could get some people on Upwork to try.
I just had a really quick question, because you mentioned that the VCs are more likely to invest in older companies or more mature ones. What is going on with the younger ones that are just starting out? I was just curious if you could comment on that a little bit.
So that's we didn't explore anything from let's say company point of view, in terms that another drawback, and we don't see, for example, companies that didn't receive investment. We only see the ones that received them. So if a lot of younger companies didn't receive any investment, we just will not even see them in our sample. So that's probably why we cannot really say a lot about what is happening with some younger companies. What we can do is probably to look at the even earlier stage investments, such as angel investment or accelerator investing, and to see, because usually those are smaller companies. So it will be interesting to see now they're suffering and they're also not getting, for example, VC investment after the smaller investment.
It's a pretty fantastic question, because from the census rate, the number of startups is way up. So I don't know. Sorry, if the total number that's funded by VCs are down, it might be coming to discussion earlier. They're just starting remotely. They need so little capital. It's really interesting, actually, if there's loads of startups they're just not raising capital because they can do it off internal funds or.
From the companies or the startups themselves, but they could be remotely located, so they're not really geography. And then also the VCs are investing differently too, like geography.
Yes.
So
No, this is definitely for the company you mentioned.
So I'll be real quick, like 30 seconds. So building on Jose's point earlier and next point, you could scrape the LinkedIn profiles of these founders and see whether they moved location, whether they went from California to somewhere else. But also I'm curious, like how they signal quality. Is it educational ties? So is it still like you need a degree from Stanford to get funded, even if you're living in Ohio? So that'll be.
Yeah, this is a great idea. And we're thinking that definitely we should do that. Also for repeated founders, usually it's much easier to raise money. So yes, that would be one of the next directions. Thank you.
We are delighted to hear from Jackie about virtual water coolers.
Oh, I think
going to be super, super critical for this kind of apprenticeship culture that we have. And importantly, for onboarding newcomers into the company who don't have social capital, who are just trying to learn the ropes and trying to learn how to be productive in their jobs. And so here's our research question that we wanted to address, which is how can managers in a remote workplace organize social interactions to improve performance and career outcomes of organizational newcomers? I'm just going to tell you very briefly what we did and some research, our results, and then dive into those a little bit deeper as we go on. And so what we did was partner with a large global organization to conduct a field experiment on virtual interactions, so different types of virtual interactions. And there were 3 key aspects of our setting. We had 1,400 remote interns who are distributed across 8 divisions in 16 program cities. They all worked remotely though, but they would have been physically located in 16 cities. And it was a 5-week remote internship in the summer of 2020. So right in the height of the pandemic. So everything was remote. And then we have data on their weekly performance, their career outcomes. And then we also have survey data and also open text comments of their attitudes towards remote work and also their job satisfaction. And so this is how we thought about designing those virtual interactions. So on one dimension, we varied the synchronicity of these virtual interactions. And so they were either synchronous, so think small group Zoom sessions, or they were asynchronous and think something like a Slack chat or a discussion forum. And then we varied the hierarchy of them. And so what did it matter whether you just had these interactions with peers like you, or did you need them with senior managers? Here's just a little bit more detail about those experimental conditions. The first 2 here are the ones that we call the virtual water coolers. And those are those Zoom sessions with 3 or 4 interns as the first option. And then the second option is the one with the senior manager in it. And then something that we did that was leveraging a new panel experimental design that one of our co-authors, Yav Bojanov, developed is this ability to vary the frequency or the dose of your experimental treatment. And so each of these interns exogenously were assigned to anywhere between 0 to 4 virtual water coolers during the course of their internship. And then so we had 3 other conditions, and one of them was the Q&A discussion forum. And so this was just imagine being an intern, and then you were asked a question each week, or you were allowed to ask a question each week, and then you had a senior manager who could potentially respond to your question on a discussion forum. And then we also had an intern group project for 3 or 4 interns, and this is an opportunity for the interns to come together each week and work with one another on a project that they would do. And then finally, we had this control condition that didn't have any sort of virtual interactions. And so maybe because I'm the last presentation, but I want to ask everyone this question: which one do you think worked the best? Yeah. Yes, exactly. Compared to the control, which one worked best? Okay. Receiving, so number 3? 3, okay. Well, it turns out that we didn't find a main effect at all. And like it took us some time to like really come around to acknowledge this because, I think we did think that, perhaps it could have been the asynchronous Q&A discussion forum, or it could have been really what we thought was the virtual water cooler with the senior manager would have outperformed. And if you squint really hard, perhaps the senior manager water cooler did outperform the control condition, but it really was a null effect. And so for the rest of this time we have together, I think let's discuss why that might have happened. And then we're also planning an online study to try and get at some of the mechanisms, and we'll get into that in a little more detail. The one thing that I will note is that there was an exception, and then when those virtual water coolers with senior managers either had a demographic match in terms of gender and ethnicity, They outperformed the control by 8 percentage points in terms of these interns were more likely to receive a job offer. And then when they got a high dose or high frequency, so three or four of them in this 5-week period, they were also more likely to receive a job offer than the control. We rely on our objective explanations to kind of figure out like what was going on here. And looking at their surveys and then also their open text, one thing we found was that there were just these trade-offs on, well, I get this chance to network and potentially get feedback and advice, but the downside here is that I have a lot of work to do as an intern, and I have reduced focus time and I'm being distracted by having this, virtual water cooler or whatever it is being scheduled into my day. And then we also found through our text analysis that the interns felt more tired and they had like these conflicting demands on their day, which is consistent with that kind of explanation. All right, so for the rest of this, I'll just briefly talk about the data and methods, our experimental results, go through some of the surveys, and then also open text comments that we looked at. And then what I would really love to do is to get your feedback on this online study that we're designing at the moment to try and test some of the mechanisms. And the reason why we're doing this, well, the first reason was because the editorial team told us to, but then, taking a step back, we really think that this is going to help us understand, how you can design these kinds of virtual interactions in the future, at least we hope. All right, so in terms of our data sources, we have the job offer at the end of the internship. That's our main outcome. We also have final performance. The results are pretty consistent across the two of those. And we have the survey data on the satisfaction with the job, open text responses to their highlights and lowlights. So they had to say, like, what was the highlight of your week and what was the low light of your week? And then we have their comments on that. And then we also have the demographic match data, which is between the interns and the senior managers on whether they were a match demographically or not. And then for the methods, we had a block randomization design. And so we used 2 complementary analysis using just the simple block difference in means, and then also fully saturated OLS models where we have division dummies. Everything was block randomized at the division level, and then fully interacted with the experimental conditions. Okay. So let's just try and deep dive a little bit into these results. So I mentioned that we had no positive treatment effect. But the thing that I didn't mention as well is that to our surprise, the Q&A, the asynchronous Q&A, and also the intern group project underperformed the control. And so the interns that were given this opportunity to ask a question and then they potentially received a reply, they underperformed, as well as the interns who worked together as a group. The one thing that, this here is a figure of the senior manager water cooler as the baseline condition. And so all the comparisons are either to the senior manager water cooler without a match or with a match, which is yellow. And then you can see through the yellow bars that this is where we see some action here with the virtual interactions. And so the interns that got the senior manager water cooler outperformed when they shared a demographic match with gender and ethnicity with their senior manager. And then the other thing we saw was when they got a high dose of them, so 3 or 4, as opposed to 0 or 2, which is the blue, they also seem to outperform all the other experimental conditions. And so now I'm just going to turn to some of the survey findings. And so we asked the interns at the end of the program, what was your satisfaction with remote work on a few different dimensions? And these are fully interactive OLS models of their program of their end of program attitudes on those different experimental conditions. And then the thing that I just want to highlight is that there was no significant differences in terms of their satisfaction to remote work. But one thing that did seem to pop up versus the control condition was that these interns found that it was more difficult for them to balance their work life, personal life, as a result of having an extra hour or so scheduled into their work week. And so that was from our survey results. Our open text comments largely support this as well. In terms of what we did, we wanted to try and test certain mechanisms. And so I mentioned this trade-off. And so we were thinking about, did these interns potentially get advice and feedback, or did they get to network? And were we able to pick up words associated with networking advice and feedback, or synonyms of those? And so we found the synonyms using word embedding models. And so essentially what we did was look for the probability that the interns would use words that were associated with information sharing, and we'll see whether or not that varied by their experimental condition. And here, if you just look at models 3, 4, 5, in terms of where I've highlighted here, you see that in the intern, senior manager, water cooler, we do see some weak evidence here that they did potentially get some feedback and advice when they had this opportunity to talk with a senior manager. Similarly, this is a similar analysis, but looking at the other end of what the drawback is. And when we looked at the open text for words associated with being tired or stressed or conflict, we see here that the interns that were in the experimental conditions, except for the Q&A, did feel like did mention the words being tired or having more conflict in terms of their workday. And this is just one quote, but this is representative of several of the comments we saw, which is just towards the end, I was just absolutely exhausted and overwhelmed, and I felt very worried that I wouldn't be able to make substantial progress on my project. And so those are some of the comments that we got in terms of the negative aspects of the job that they were facing. So in the remaining 5 minutes or so, I want to turn to this online vignette study that we are currently designing. And this is not something that we've run yet. And so your feedback would be really useful. And what we wanted to do is try and understand why potentially this senior manager water cooler with the demographic match may have outperformed. And so these interns were about 8 percentage points more likely to get a job offer.
Can you say what the demographic match is?
Yeah, and so they were, yeah, so gender and ethnicity. So if, and so exactly, so if you're female and white female, then your senior manager was also a white female, for example. And so we thought about like possible mechanisms that could be going on from the intern's perspective. We don't have access into what was going on in the senior manager. And so we're not thinking about it from that perspective at the moment. But 3 plausible mechanisms that we've thought of at least is the ability to form ties with people, getting advice that's important for the job or to doing well in your internship, and then also organizational attachment. And so because I get to interact with a senior manager, I just feel like I can do better, or I should work harder as an intern. And so our vignette study is really trying to replicate the scenario, which is 2020, you're doing a short 5-week remote internship and setting the stage there. And so we're going to be recruiting 18 to 32-year-olds from in the Boston area who could be kind of subjects that would be doing internships, either for an analyst program or for an associate program, as if you're MBAs. We have 250 to about 350 participants is what we're targeting. And the scenario, as I mentioned, is, they are going to be at this company, and we're letting them know that a key part of the process is trying to meet others through networking and information exchange. And so these are our different experimental conditions that we're working with. And so there's 8 different conditions, and depending on who the gender and ethnicity of the participant, we're either going to randomly assign them to the control condition, where the control for the conditions or scenarios 2 through 8 is going to be the white male. That's the dominant gender and ethnicity of the firm in terms of their senior managers. And then the treatment is going to be that gender and ethnicity match. And so one thing I'll mention here is that we are not going to be testing against the control condition, but we're going to be testing, everybody is going to be in a senior manager water cooler. and we're going to be testing is the effects of having a demographic match as opposed to no match. At least that's what the current design looks like. But if you have alternative suggestions or thoughts, I think that would be helpful as well. Okay, so this is just a quick flow of what things will look like. And so if you are a Black male and you are the participant, we're going to collect that information from a pre-survey as this subjects come into our online vignette study. And then they're going to be randomly assigned a control or a treatment condition. And so that would be the treatment and control. And they will see a picture of a senior manager when they come into the study set. And when they come into the study and they read the scenario. And so in the vignette, we say that, you do some introductions you're here with 3 or 4 other interns and this senior manager. And after some introductions, you then pose a question. And so that participant is going to read that the question that they pose is, given that we are in unprecedented times due to the world current events, what advice would you give interns to more easily adapt and adjust to new changes within the firm? And then the senior manager is going to give 3 pieces of advice that they're also going to read. And they're going to be roughly around networking outside of your team, what you should do to produce high quality work. And then third, how do you communicate progress with your supervisor and your team? And then finally, after reading these tips or these pieces of advice, the participant is going to answer any sort of answer our post-survey questions, which are going to be about advice taking, organizational commitment, and intent to stay, which were the 3 plausible mechanisms that we have thought of that could be possibly explaining why our senior manager with a match was outperforming the other conditions. And so that's the online study that we are designing. And just to wrap up, I think that one of the key insights here is that managers, when they're thinking about giving these opportunities for virtual interactions, we have to think about the pros and cons. It's not just that having the opportunity is necessarily a good thing, because you have to think about the trade-offs as well. And the trade-offs aren't necessarily just on the interns or the newcomers' perspectives, because you could think about distractions and reduced focus time when you're trying to do your work. But also it's super costly to get senior managers involved. They're the ones, at least in this company, who are making the deals happen, building the relationships. And so you're asking them to take out an hour of their day to interact with these interns. And so there are costs involved with doing things like, especially if the newcomers are having these at a high frequency. And so I think it begs the question of how we can actually engineer more productive virtual water coolers. And so here we just saw, based on our results, that it depends on things like demographic matches and having a high dose of them. But are there other attributes that are important? And then also how we might be able to think about bringing together people in these free spaces that Aruna mentioned yesterday, in ways that we aren't currently thinking about and with our existing technologies. So that is all that I had. And so thank you so much. And I look forward to your comments. Okay.
I'm happy to start. Do you know the time of day where these water cooler events happened?
Yes, so they were all they were part of their scheduled workday. And so they all happened, in normal working hours. And so sometime between like 9 and 5. The thing that is interesting though, is because everybody was remote, 9 to 5, like Eastern time in New York, could be like really different from where people were actually located.
This wasn't done experimentally. I just wondered this story about it taking up time. I mean, maybe the afternoons people have switched off already, and this kind of water cooler event doesn't detract from their ability to do their hard work.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a nice point. And I think if we could go back and see that kind of information, that it could give us some granularity into it. Yeah. Oh, okay, thanks.
So I'm wondering, how much evidence do we have that in-person water coolers are useful? you know, in my experience, a lot of interactions are actually quite useless and take a lot of time.
Well, yeah, interesting.
Do we have any systematic evidence on that from, you know, pre-COVID literature?
For in-person water
yeah.
coolers? Well, so it's funny you say that, because the way that, well, so when Raj asked me to join the project, it was because, so so one of the things that we looked at was like these in-person, like serendipitous encounters. And it is a, you know, a setting where it's a symposium. And so it's a conference that brought doctors together. But we do find that you know, these having 90 minutes of randomly assigned like information sharing matches, so like speed dating, can have long-term implications on people's collaboration patterns, and then in terms of like publications. And so they publish more when they've been together, and then also on their learning and knowledge transfer. So I know that, but there's a but, and that's when they share some sort of common interest. So either they have the similar training by field, or they have intellectual interests. So they're interested in the same
that would be
topic.
consistent
So,
with your story.
Yeah. Otherwise, they're not that useful.
Gonna make a point about if you could randomize common interests, but not about work and you know, but rather do they like, you know, same sports? Do they do things? I find that social interactions, particularly with seniors, are much easier for me if we randomly find out that we have something in common outside work, and that builds an emotional link that could explain why they get job offers. So you could do the same exact what you're doing with race, but then figure out what their outside interests are, and then randomize whether they meet people that have or not those common interests.
Right. Like I'm trying to think if we could do something with the online study to try and get at that dimension, which could be adding something new as opposed to replicating. Yeah, cool. Thanks.
One thing, I mean, there is one difference with the real water cooler. That is actually spontaneous and really random. It's not scheduled. Instead, you are
totally
scheduled. So that might also explain why the negative productivity effect.
Yeah, that totally. And I think that's one thing that we say in the paper. It's because these things are scheduled, that there's no serendipity in it. Yeah. You just have to do it when you're. You just leave a room open and people join if they want. Possibly, yes, that could be another, yeah.
Thank you, very interesting. I have one conceptual question or comment actually coming from my political economy side. So what we know from the literature, social trust and social capital is really hard to build, very easy to destroy. So duration of your intervention is just 5 weeks. And I don't see how one would expect to build firm-specific social capital in such a short amount of time. Even if you had built, you could have actually basically wear off, because there's another paper at the AER which basically shows that right after the football matches in Africa, when the team wins, social cohesion increases, but the effects do not persist over time. So I was wondering whether conceptually you could basically track these people over a longer amount of time.
Yeah, that would be really nice if we could. I don't know if we can with this specific data, but you made me think of something else, which is like, you know, the cohesion increases right afterwards. And so what we do have access to is like, you know, when they receive the water cooler, and then we could look at their comments or like how they felt that week, the specific week. But yeah, no, it's a good point though.
Stimulates the mic.
There's one there.
Thank you, very interesting.
Well, I can hear you, so for our people online, yeah, I know totally.
Okay, so so I wonder, I mean, in your vignette experiment right now, you're going to compare like the match, white man, and all the other demographics.
Yeah.
So does the sample size in what you've done already allows you to show the results separately for white men and the other demographics, if the effect of the matches is already different in what you've done? And the other, because that's very interesting. I mean, unless like 80% of these matches here are white men with white men.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think if the sample size allows, it would be lovely to see even from that experiment that you already completed. And the other question is, I mean, maybe you should consider if the water coolers are spontaneous. I'm a little bit perplexed that the planned one, virtual, are added like on top of your 8 hours of work. So, because
yeah.
normally I'm meeting with a manager for this interest would not be staying longer hours. It would be part of the job, I guess.
It is part of their job. So it's like part of their schedule. So I didn't describe this very well, but they have like a fixed schedule of activities that everybody has this like online portal. And then for each hour, they have like a set of activities that they should be doing. And so if you were in a treatment condition, then on your schedule, you would just see that you have a virtual water cooler. If you're the control, then you have this free time to do whatever you want with that time. So maybe these people were doing work during that time. So, yeah. So it's like free time, really, to do whatever you want.
Comments. One, do the data distinguish between statistically similar but economically quite different outcomes? So you defined a particular notion of demographic match. Do the data tell us that that's the right notion of demographic match relative to, say, female, female, male, male, or just matching on ethnicity? You know, you've kind of imposed a lot of priors here, and you know, you've got modest size samples, so I'm not sure the data even distinguish among those hypotheses, but you can check and tell us whether they do. So, second comment, I very much encourage you to put a shadow value on senior managers' time. And then calculate, give us some sense of whether this is worth it, or a different way to put it, how big would the effect on giving an offer have to be, and how much value do you have to put on it on giving an offer to one of these interns to actually make it worthwhile to divert senior managers' valuable time in this direction. I'm sort of motivated by the many brilliant ideas my colleagues have for ways for me to spend my time, implicitly assigning a zero shadow value to my time. So that seems like a critical ingredient here if you're actually trying to inform what firms ought to do in this respect.
Thanks for that comment. That's a really great idea. And yeah, I think we should definitely do that, the shadow value. And then in terms of the first comment, we only have the demographic match in terms of gender and ethnicity, but if we do the online study and focus on the matching, we could vary gender or we could vary ethnicity.
You could also just tell us in these data, do your data actually favor your definition of a demographic match relative to just matching on gender or just matching on ethnicity?
Right, that's the data we don't have. They only gave us.
They didn't give us the specifics.
Oh, goodness gracious. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's.
No, we only know the full match. And then in terms of male or female, yeah, we don't know. Yeah.
This was an investment match.
That's it. That's unfortunate.
So my comment doesn't apply. Most of the people that you know, the gender,
Yeah.
intern, and
It's okay. It's a common thing that everybody's like, well, don't you know both of them? And we don't.
Come on, sorry, but I think it was really interesting. By revealed preference, having talked to quite a few of these companies that were fully remote, even pre-pandemic, I don't think they did that. So they didn't have these online meetings. What they tend to have, I think, is offline gatherings like every other month, which kind of suggests, like, if you talk to Automatic or Artemis Connection or Upwork, I don't think they did that, but you could ask them. Be worthwhile knowing because they've been at it for years and have figured this thing out. And I think it would be the idea that it's just not worth the time, but you do want a bomb, but it turns out it's better to go to Albuquerque, New Mexico every other month and have people there for 4 days.
Yeah.
Kind of like this, in a sense, that we could have all been meeting, you know. But I should self-censor myself.
Dinner makes houses worth many online meetings.
Yeah.
So, but yeah.
Thank you.
I was going to turn it off actually before. Since it's fantastic,
Okay. Oh.